So welcome to this keynote event for iLearn 2021, featuring Judith Okonkwo, who is associated with Imisi 3D, the World Economic Forum, and many other organizations, and she is a leader in bringing XR to the African continent and fostering opportunities for creation there. Now, I am going to upload a video that Judith has provided for us. And in the meantime, I would like to ask Judith if she wouldn't mind sort of talking a little bit about her work in broad, general introductory terms.
Karen, not at all. It would be my pleasure. Thank you so much. So good evening, everyone. It's 8:30 in the evening for us here in Lagos, Nigeria, and it's such a pleasure to be with you all today at iLearn. So one of the reasons that you'll be watching a video while I'm actually on stage is because my internet connection has been a tad bit spotty, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't drop off mid-presentation. So I tried to quickly do a recording of that, which will play. But before then, I thought it would be fantastic to introduce myself directly to you. My name is Judith. I run a creation lab, what I describe as a creation lab called Imisi 3D. We're based in Lagos, Nigeria, but I would say we have a continental remit to develop the ecosystem for the extended reality technologies across the African continent. And we tend to focus in three ways to do that. One is the kind of like first touch and feel of the technologies for people. The second is building a community of XR practitioners, creators. And the third is focusing on areas in which we feel these technologies can have significant impact for our communities. I do touch on this during the presentation, so I won't dive in too much, but I will share a few kind of like interesting facts, I suppose. So one is that Imisi, the first part of the lab's name, Imisi 3D, is a Yoruba word, and Yoruba is the ethnic group in the southwestern part of Nigeria, and it means inspiration. And one of the reasons why we chose that word to represent what we do is because we believe that these technologies provide a pathway to so many possibilities for people in Nigeria and across the continent. And that together with the inspiration they inspire, we can actually start to create solutions that will transform everyday living. So I'll stop now because I think the video ran over a little bit, but I definitely look forward to engaging with you in conversation following that. Thank you all.
Okay, I will start the video now. And
good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I am very much looking forward to engaging with you and talking a little bit about ways in which we might advance learning and research on the African continent.
I am not hearing
Thank you very much to iLearn. It's truly an honor to be asked to do this keynote. So let's get right into it. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about myself. You already know my name is Judith. But what you might not know is that when I was a little child, one of my favorite toys was the Viewmaster. And now when you see what I get up to most days, it probably starts to make a lot of sense. But yes, back in the day, I would have some sort of headset up against my face, and that's still true, many odd years later. I have, over the last 5, 6, 7 years, immersed myself in the immersive technology field. But my professional background is in business psychology, and I spent a number of years as a business psychologist, also as a researcher, and spending a little bit of time in academia. And about 8 years ago, I was doing doctoral studies. I was focused on studying leadership in Africa. And I was in London at the time. So as you can imagine, I thought it might be prudent to spend a bit more time in an African city if this was going to be my focus. I did a bit of traveling. I was fortunate to visit a number of African cities. but I eventually ended up in Lagos for a number of reasons, but it was the softest landing. I will own up to that. And while I was there, I met an incredible young man. His name is Ian Oluwaboyeji, and he was this young kind of like dynamite whiz kid who was just coming off the end of one startup that didn't quite go as he wanted, and about to start another one, which you might have heard of if you follow the technology ecosystem on the African continent, and that's Andela. And what intrigued me about Andela at the time was that two things. Well, first of all, the CEO used to say brilliance is evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. And I'm a very big believer in creating opportunity wherever and whenever you can for people. And the second was the strapline that they set it off with, which was, even if you've never written a line of code before in your life, we'll make you a world-class developer in 6 months, you know, and that was, of course, with a few caveats. You had to have the drive, you had to have the ability, you know, to put that into practice. But where it really changed the game, in a country like Nigeria, where, you know, to get a good job, you would need a first degree, sometimes you would need a second degree, that sort of thing, just because the market was so saturated in terms of graduates and, you know, so many other socioeconomic issues. Andela came in and said, well, you know, we don't actually care what you studied or where you studied, you know, or how you studied. All that matters is that you can hack it in this program. And so if you could pass the entry tests, you were in. And what that meant was, in our first full cohort, we had people who had master's degrees from the UK. We had people who had just left secondary school, which is high school, in Nigeria, all together, all willing and ready to learn and really showcase the best of themselves and their abilities. Now, if there's one thing that Andela reaffirmed for me, it was just that, you know, like Nigeria for starters, but, you know, across the continent, you will find some of the most brilliant, hardworking people you'll encounter anywhere in the world, really, truly. And it moved me in new ways because I've often felt that we're lagging too far behind when it comes to things like technology. And to see these young people just really get up and go once they were given a little bit of opportunity was fantastic. I spent a year with Andela, and you know, I did help them with the setup in Lagos. Towards the end of that time, they were just getting started in Nairobi. And when I left, which was towards the end of 2015, I was thinking about what next. For me, there was obviously a very strong draw to the continent. I'm sorry, but London weather was just not appealing at that point, but also just all of the potential, all of the possibility that was in the air at the time. It was also the time when, you know, that excitement was evident in the VR consumer space, right? Because we had all of these products coming into the market. We had just come off the wave of Google Cardboards and the VK1s and the Samsung Gear VR was coming, and it was just such a fantastic time. And as you can imagine, I mean, check out that Viewmaster. I was ready. I was just like waiting in line in London. I'm going to be the first to get the new Samsung Gear VR. And I did get it. And it was everything that I imagined. And I imagined not so much what it could do then, but what it would enable us to do, you know, all of the potential with a technology like this. And just putting it on, I could think about so many different ways in which it could be used, so many different solutions that people might build. And this is just little me, you know, one person thinking, imagine if hundreds, thousands, millions of people across the continent were doing the same thing, working with this technology and not just, you know, thinking about the possibilities, but actually making it happen, actually building. I thought that's something that must happen. And I talked a fair bit about it, but I know that talk isn't ever enough. So I decided to also do it. And that's why I set up Imisi 3D. Imisi 3D is what I would describe as an ecosystem developer for the extended reality technologies on the African continent. So that's the backdrop. And all of this was happening in a time that I would describe as the technology renaissance, certainly in Nigeria, but I think across most of the African continent. And I would say this probably started around, 2010, 2011. And I say renaissance because, of course, there is a history of, technology, entrepreneurship, and industry and activity. But I think that, all of a sudden in the last decade, there was this awakening, and you'd usually hear it when people started to talk about changing the narrative. So previously, it was always Africa as the numbers, the markets. People would talk about Nigeria, almost 200 million people, 200 million consumers. Of course, that's not quite the case, but that was what would drive. Nobody was thinking of Nigeria or of the African continent as the creators. 200 million people who would create products that we would all buy. No, that wasn't the case. And we definitely, I think for a lot of people in the space, were part of this movement to change that narrative from consumers to creators of technology. So here, I just want to quickly look at a timeline. Some of the things that I think were fairly significant in this journey from an XR perspective. I don't go too far back, just to 2015. And 2015, I mention here because of two organizations that have been really pivotal in driving the XR ecosystem for a number of reasons. The first is Black Rhino VR in Kenya. Now, they initially started out as a production company, and actually they have a traditional film production company, and then also started VR and 360 production. And they have done a tremendous amount of work. If you don't know them, please check them out. Please check some of their fantastic 360 productions out as well. But they've evolved from just purely production into, the critical work of building an ecosystem where they are now supporting the community, investing into the community, and making sure that there is access to these extended reality technologies. The second organization there is Electric South, and they run a New Dimensions VR lab that they started to run in 2015. And although this is a program and an initiative that is focused on artists, it's also been really critical because, of course, when we started to think about XR on the continent, and a lot was about 360 as well, because of course that was where there was significant traction. The challenge was that even if there was content about Africa, it wasn't made by Africans. And New Dimensions certainly changed that. They would invite a yearly cohort from across the continent of artists. They would bring them down to South Africa for a week, where they would spend time with experts from around the world, learning about the different tools of the trade, the different techniques they could employ, and then going ahead to produce. And those productions, as you can imagine, have also fueled learning around the world about, the different realities of African life. We go into 2016, and here I mentioned the Lagos Virtual Reality Hackathon. Now, this was certainly in West Africa, and there are debates about whether or not it's a continent-wide reality, but the first hackathon specifically bringing people together to build for virtual reality. And for this hackathon, we asked people to create solutions for either education, healthcare, or tourism. And the reason we selected these verticals was because we had identified these as areas where there was room for significant impact locally. That hackathon, even just putting the word out and trying to get people to apply to participate, was one that I think captured the imagination of the continent in a little way, because there were applications from as far afield as Botswana and Zimbabwe for this event that was planned as local in Lagos, Nigeria. And the exciting things that come out of that. We go into 2017, and here I just mentioned Oculus Connect. Now, I would say that when it comes to global XR events, there have been limited participation, from the African continent in general and even from organizations specifically. But this year at Oculus Connect, they were actually interested in exploring on one of their panels, community building in different parts of the world, and there was an African perspective on that. We moved to 2018, and a number of things stand out here. So first of all, I want to mention Facebook's FB Startup Accelerator that they started up in Nigeria. It was the first of its kind in sub-Saharan Africa that was wholly focused on deep tech. And now this was a complete game changer because for the first time, there was a program that was saying to young people, build for XR and we will support you. And the way the accelerator was structured, they would support startups, but they would also support students at the master's and the undergraduate level. And then the other initiative I want to mention for 2018 is UNICEF's Innovation Fund, because that year they actually selected 2 African programs that were focused on the use of VR for education into that, and that was also first. We come to 2019, and if you are into entertainment and the immersive space, then you might know that that year at the Venice Film Festival, a 360 documentary called Daughters of Chibok won the Golden Lion for the best VR story. And this is so important, not only because certainly no African had ever won a Golden Lion for VR, but also because this was, Africans telling their own story in this new medium, in this new way. And Daughters of Chibok is a piece, a documentary piece that has gone on to kind of like inform learning in places like Harvard University and in the California College of the Arts. So really, really thrilled that Indigenous immersive filmmaking is shaping our learning and understanding. And in 2019, of course, we also can't forget another significant event, which was the setup of Microsoft's ADCs, their Africa Development Centers. And they set these up in Lagos and Nairobi. And this is particularly pivotal in the XR ecosystem timeline on the continent, because for the first time, a major technology company had set up an engineering team for mixed reality and AI. So actual XR engineering, actual building happening on the continent. There's a bit of a twist to that, but at least there's that. And for once, like people could see, career pathways right in front of them that were related to XR, because that was one of the challenges when, you were trying to encourage people to get into it. When it's the day-to-day hustle and grind, the question will be, well, how am I going to survive if I'm doing XR? And this was, I think, a big stake in the ground saying, hey, this is one of the ways. And then we move on to 2020 last year, and just 2 things I'd like to mention here. The first is that there was an AR/VR, another hackathon, and this time it went further afield. As you can imagine, because of the pandemic, it now had to hold as a virtual hackathon, and that was an adventure in itself, a virtual hackathon for the most part. But what that also allowed is that instead of the 10 countries it was initially scheduled for, it was then opened up to the entire continent. And so 28 African countries participated, about 1,000 people went on to build over 5 months. So that did take quite a bit of time. And then finally, I want to mention the Templeton World Charity Foundation's research grant that was awarded to the Lagos Business School for a 2-year study on the use of virtual reality gaming for character development in teenagers. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But, I think just a little plotting of the journey of some of the things that have been happening in the XR ecosystem. And this is by no means exhaustive, because of course there's a lot of tremendous stuff happening in so many other parts of the continent that should be brought up. Okay, so against this backdrop, of course, I want to talk, a little bit more about our work at Imisi 3D. As I said, we're focused on developing the African ecosystem, and we do that in a number of ways. We have, I suppose, three areas of focus. So one is, evangelization, I sometimes call it, but just getting people to understand what the technologies are, getting them their first touch, their first feel. The second, very critical, is to make sure that we have a community of creators, people who can use these technologies for whatever we need on the African continent. Because I think the reality that we can all acknowledge is that, there aren't people around the world who will consciously build for you with a true understanding of your reality, right, and your local context. So if we can harness that potential locally, all the better. And then the third area of focus is that we want to spend time and support people who want to use XR, but also look at specific sectors or verticals where we think we can have impact and there will be positive impact in general in the community. So I'm going to do a quick pause so that I can play this video. And this is just a throwback to one of the meetups that we have in the lab. This is obviously pre-pandemic, but in a quest to make sure that we are building this community of creators, we host online and offline meetups, as well as different events that can support people who want to build or who want to engage or who want to learn. It's really great to see kind of like a whole community start to come together. People, didn't really know that much about the technologies. Now, interests are really looking for ways to connect together, which is brilliant.
I built my first VR and I tested it and it was fun because I was just following practical steps online. I brought it out for girls in my hostel to come and check and see the excitement in their face looking at the whole thing. And some of them would ask me, what's this? What's this? And I said, this is virtual reality, and they really, really enjoyed it.
There were several persons who asked, hey, that's great, but how do we learn more? Or that's also what someone has just before, like how can I go further after this? So if people just say, oh, that's cool, and I try and bye-bye, like, well, I'm already happy. But if they say, what's the next step and how can I learn faster and better, then I'm like, okay, they are actually interested in building for the medium. So that was very, very positive. Yeah, some cool ideas on what to do.
I also want to talk a little bit about this project that we did. So this, I'd spoken a little bit on the timeline about the UNICEF Innovation Fund actually working with two programs on the African continent, and that decision being made in 2018. And we ran a VR for Schools program, which was one. And here you have teachers from a local school that we partnered with, Jibo High School, which is junior secondary, which is about middle school. And what we would do is, first of all, go into the schools, introduce them to the technology. But then subsequently, with support from UNICEF, we now focused on actually creating virtual reality content for 3 subjects. We co-created this with the teachers. So as you can see, we would hold workshops where we would bring them into our lab, and it was really sessions of learning. We would understand what it was like to teach in the school environment that they were in. We would learn about their pain points. We had also done visits to the school and done sessions in the school to get a deeper understanding of what they were telling us. And then we, of course, introduced them to, VR and AR, and then have them tell us, what they thought was possible with the technologies. So they would explore ways in which they might be able to use it in the classroom, but then even more importantly, start to identify for us the subjects where they thought it would have the most impact. Eventually, we settled on doing content for 3 subjects, mathematics, basic science, and physical and health education. And for a variety of reasons, they had decided that there were topics in these subjects where the students struggled in particular and would benefit from the immersive environments and learning that you could get with VR. And I'll show you just a little bit of a clip from one of those preliminary results from that work with the VR modules in the public junior secondary school. Have quite encouraging numbers. So even though the majority of students, at least 95%, were having their first encounter with the technology, they had an overwhelmingly positive, enjoyable experience. So as you can see there, about 90% of them agreed that VR was enjoyable, and 10% were neutral. And we also had positive feedback in terms of what it did for their interest in the subject. So about 80% of students letting us know that it increased their interest in the subject. These are very early days yet, and this project was paused because of the pandemic, but the plan is to go ahead and do a pilot study that will actually determine if VR as a learning aid can actually increase learning outcomes for the students compared to traditional methods of teaching. So we look forward to doing that. But enough of Imisi 3D, we'll turn our lens now to the continent in general and some of the work that's going on there. Well, I start with a few numbers, and I know they might look fairly grim, some of them, but I think it's important to set the context for the discussion. So I've mentioned Nigeria and the population there a number of times. The current estimate is about 210 million people. But unfortunately, alongside that, it is also a country that has the highest number of children who are out of school. Now, if you try and do some research, you'll see numbers fluctuating between 10.5 to 13.2 million. But I think one thing that we will all agree on is that even if it's one child, that's far too many. So a really unfortunate number. Another thing that, of course, is spoken about quite often is the fact that Africa is a very young population, and Nigeria is a case in point. 44% of the population are aged 14 and under. And I think that you would see the same sort of statistics across the African continent. In fact, I would go so far as to describe Africa as the workforce of the future because of how young the continent is, over half the population in the youth category, and the birth rate. And the final statistic here is the failure rate for the West African Examination Council exams that students take when they're leaving secondary school or high school, would be the equivalent here. And that is at a whopping 36%. So, some sense of the facts behind these sorts of headlines that you might see when people are considering things like learning on the African continent, especially from a traditional school system point of view. And you can see the BBC headline there talking about Nigeria's educational crisis. And, it's a perfect storm of several things: aging infrastructure that exists in the country for education, of course, the population, the really rapid growth, and the fact that we have not been able to keep up with that in terms of the facilities that we're creating to educate our young people. Mentioned here, and this is from the United Nations, talking about the huge disparities that you will see in education on the continent. And that's because while in the majority of the public schools, and this is where well over 90% of the population will be educated, you have fairly basic infrastructure available. On the other hand, there are elite private schools where your education and your facilities will rank with the best in the world. And that gap and the problems it provides are increasing every day. And then we turn to research. And this article from the conversation talks about how important research on the African continent is, not just for Africans, but for the whole world. And I particularly like this sentence where they say, there are many levels in which the future of the world, not just Africa's, rests on African research. And they actually went on to talk about 4 specific areas, and I thought I'd highlight them for this conversation that we're going to have. The first, of course, is something that we've mentioned a few times, and that is the fact that the continent is the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. Like I said, workforce of the future. The second is that Africans represent the oldest and the most diverse genome in the world. And you can imagine all of the follow-on possibilities in terms of research that comes from that. The third, of course, is the fact that 1/4 of the global disease burden is actually found on the African continent. And that is something that really, really needs to change. And then finally, of course, we know that scientific research, in fact, much research, is a vital driver of economies. And I think that without a doubt, we can all agree that that's something that should be invested in on the African continent. Now, of course, although this news looks fairly grim, there has been significant progress made when it comes to research on the African continent. The numbers are still very low, far too low for the size of the continent, but between 2012 and 2016, research output doubled on the African continent. So baby steps, but we're getting there. But, you know, we've contemplated what is, and now I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the people who are creating what should be and where their journeys are at the moment. So this is, as you can see from an article that was published earlier this year, and I have highlighted Brian Afande there, who is the CEO of Black Rhino VR that I talked about earlier when we were looking at that timeline for the African XR ecosystem. And the reason he's featured here is because his organization has worked with Newcastle University, who were lead investigators, and Kenyatta University in Kenya to create virtual reality content that will help train midwives. Now, for this particular project, their focus was on one of the really large refugee camps in Kenya, where there have been a lot of issues with neonatal and maternal mortality. And that's because, of course, of the shortage of midwives, and you know, healthcare in general is under-resourced there. So what they've done is to go ahead and create training content that can be delivered via VR, so that they can increase the number of midwives available to serve the community. Oh, and one thing I should mention, so with each of these, I have gone ahead to, if they have a Twitter presence, to put their Twitter handles if you wanted to follow up and see a bit more of the work that they're doing. This next page takes us to Nigeria, and this lady, Yewande Akinjewe, you might recognize her from the video that you watched earlier of the community meetup in Lagos. And she, at the time, was still a student and actually traveled by road, a journey of about 4 or 5 hours just to attend that meetup and to engage with others who are interested in XR. Following her graduation, she moved to Lagos and joined the second cohort of the FB Startup Accelerator program that, you know, we also talked about a little while ago. Her entry for that was a solution called GESL, and it's an acronym for Give Every School a Lab. And the idea was to use augmented reality to provide students with access to learning in virtual labs for the sciences. So yeah, people, I think despite all the odds, you know, going ahead to really make their own path. This is taking us back to Kenya, and this is Dr. Patience Kiyuka. You might recognize that she's right beside a 360 camera. And that's because her initiative, which was funded by the African Academy for Science Public Engagement Fund, is one where she wants to take the lab to the village. So she wants to take her research lab to children in the village to give them a sense of what it is like to be in a space like that, for them to understand the kind of work that she does. And she decided to do this in VR with 360. Finally, we come back to Nigeria, and here we have Dr. Eugene Ogu, who is the principal investigator for the Templeton World Charity Foundation grant that I mentioned previously. Now, this, as I said, is a program that will run over 2 years. And the idea is to explore the use of virtual reality gaming to teach children empathy and compassion, as well as the process of developing virtual reality games. And the reason for this, I mean, if you know anything about the history of Nigeria, it is a country that was put together as opposed to naturally formed not too long ago. And for that reason, as you can imagine, there have been divisions across a number of lines, including religious, including ethnic, that I suppose flare up from time to time. With this particular research project, Eugene is working with children in the 13 to 18-year age group to see what impact VR and VR gaming can have on getting them to let go of some of the biases they might traditionally hold. And we move on from Nigeria to Uganda. The NHS, NIH, not the NHS, the National Institute of Health in the US, their foundation, as well as NIAID, have invested in African Centers of Excellence in bioinformatics and computational biology. They first did this in Mali, but in 2019, went ahead to open a center in Uganda at Makerere University. And this is Dr. Daudi Jingo, who is the director of that space. Now, as you can imagine, the focus is on bioinformatics, and they have approached this by setting up courses, both master's and PhD programs, as well as short courses. But to supplement the general goal around developing capacity for bioinformatics and computational biology, they also wanted to make sure that the latest advances in data visualization, particularly molecular visualization, were available. And so they set up a VR lab in the center. For me personally, fantastic thing about this is that they've gone ahead to think about ways they can engage the entire academic community around this technology, as well as looking for ways to positively impact, the society at large. So apart from creating a space where people can come and find out about VR and its potential, they've also worked on creating virtual reality content for frontline health workers during the pandemic that helps them understand how best to use PPE. And finally, we come to South Africa, and this is a snapshot for the learning session that held at Henley Business School's African campus. Now, because of the pandemic, the students were not able to engage in a critical component of their postgraduate program, which would have been immersion in different African cities. I think it was originally scheduled to be Lagos and Nairobi this year, but of course they couldn't travel. So the innovators at Henley decided that they would have virtual experiences instead. They leveraged AltSpace VR to have sessions with, as you can see in this case, a speaker from Paystack, a fintech company headquartered in Nigeria, in Lagos, who then held a session for them. And that is, a quick kind of like snapshot of different activities in the learning and research space around the continent. It's fantastic to see that happening, but there is a pause. And that's because all of that is happening against this backdrop. You'll of course notice that, I'm not speaking on the Island campus main stage, as you would have expected. And one of the reasons you're watching this video instead is because of the instability of my current internet connection and the concerns around that. But hopefully things will hold for the Q&A, and will be able to engage with you then. But looking generally at the options for people on the continent, you can see that they can be fairly limited. Access to power is a challenge. You can see the numbers there. Over 640 million Africans have no access to energy. And the electrification rate is about 40%, which is the lowest in the world. And then you can see some comparisons with Europe and the United States, just to, I suppose, emphasize how much of a problem it is. And then on the right side, for me, there's some data about internet access and connectivity. And you can see, first of all, the percent of population, so the table at the top, looking at the percentage of population that do not have access to the internet. And unfortunately, a whole host of African countries making that list. And each list obviously is of the top 10. And then the table at the bottom, looking at the number of people who don't have access to the internet. And there's Nigeria showing up at number 4. That's when you think about this, and then you put this side by side with the requirements of leveraging XR for learning and research, you can see that it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge. But despite that, I think you'll find a lot of stories about people going ahead to do with whatever they can or finding solutions. So here's what might be. And this is me going back to where my head was at when I was first getting started in this space. I've always been super excited about education and what we can do to make it better, to ensure that quality education is available to everybody. And one of the things that I very quickly latched onto was the use of virtual reality to drive this. And this was the idea I had then. Well, we take VR into schools, but we know that the schools that we want to deal with are in resource-constrained environments. So what do? We take low-cost VR. We take a headset like the cardboard or some version of that. We have a VR-ready mobile phone. We have mobile broadband and a solar portable, because we know that power from the grid cannot be guaranteed. And with that, with the right content, we're then able to provide these learning experiences. And for me, this was really important because apart from the ability to take this into schools, you could then take, quite literally, the school to the child. So we could service both the children in the school system, but also the very large number of children who are out of school. That is a dream. It's one that we're still working to put into place. But as we do that, it has meant that we are able to transform a space like this in a local school to a space like this with content that the children can learn from in immersive environments that inspire them. Let's hear from one of the children.
My name is Onchekwanena. I'm in GS3C. The virtual reality and headset was very interesting. It looked real, it's educative and informative. It looks as if you're actually in the world. You behave like your environment, you learn a lot of things, it educates you, and the images, they are very close to you, as if you are really there. And I was very surprised when they told me that it wasn't expensive, that you can really do it on your own. So I feel like if this can continue, Nigeria can be a better place.
I am always moved when I listen to the children talk about their experiences with these technologies and what it means to them. And I'm also truly inspired by the possibilities that working with them open up. So for me, the question would be, given all of this, what do we do? How do we take things forward? And I think that we've seen hints of all that is possible from the journey right at the start, looking at the infusion of technical talent on the continent from organizations like Andela, that was specific just to software development. And I think that's significant for what it heralded, like, you know, what is possible if we invest in developing our people, through to the many ways in which we have seen that partnerships, collaboration, investment, and embracing of the continent makes so much more possible, whether it is the grants that make, you know, research possible that will benefit all of mankind, or the studies that are being done in collaboration between partners in different parts of the world. It all comes down to a final question for me, because I think every day about what the world will be. And this is it. The future is ours to create. What will we do? Thank you. Thank you for listening, everyone. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
I see some applause there. Let's add to it. F4, yes, fantastic. Thank you so much, Judith. Yeah, so you're getting a lot of acclaim in the comments. So yes, wow, I'm sure there must be a lot of questions. The future is ours to create, yes, and we're all here because we are interested in education and what these new technologies can do for us in tapping into the potential of the human race and of the young people around the world. So who has a question for Judith? Aha, I see. Is that Daphne? Is that you?
Yeah, thank you. That was really inspiring. Great work. I wonder, out of all these sort of projects that you've been involved in, the the educational material that you put together, what is is there a framework, is there educational framework that you've been following to create this immersive material?
Thank you, Daphne. Thank you very much for the question. So not a specific framework. I think we've taken different approaches depending on what project we're working on. For example, the VR for Schools project or program, the one where there was the image with the workshop for the teachers. We spent a lot of time kind of like immersed in the school and immersed with the teachers, actually working with them to, if you will, deconstruct their curriculum and the current methodologies they use, and then seeing the best ways in which we could transfer that to an immersive environment. Because we were working with UNICEF, we also used some of their principles around human-centered design specifically for creating immersive content for children. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. I mean, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you.
And it looks like, let's see, so I think that's Daphne's hand is still up. So I want us to continue with the discussion with the audience, but we do have a time limit on the videography. So I would just like to say that the main event is finished, and we're going to stick around for some more discussion, but the live stream will now close. So thank you to our videographers, Tony Tube Studios, and the YouTube audience. So go ahead and end the recording.